Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural NEPA Learning Conference. My name is Laura Duchessi, and I'm President and CEO of the Scranton Area Community Foundation. It's so exciting to be here today with over 200 attendees from over 9 counties in northeastern Pennsylvania, representing philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, civic and governmental organizations, and other agencies, gathered together to explore what it really means to be a learning organization, why it's important for our continued growth and efficacy, and how to implement learning practices to strengthen our organization's infrastructure and to effectively evolve. The Scranton Area Community Foundation is a public 501c3. We know many of you well. We work with you. We're thrilled to be your partner. We serve as a grant maker, a philanthropic partner to people that want to be charitable in our region, a catalyst for social change, and we strive to be a learning organization. In 2012, we established the Center for Community Leadership and Nonprofit Excellence under the premise that the stronger our regional nonprofit organizations are, the more robust and successful our region is. As foundations, nonprofit organizations, and civic groups, we believe that strengthening our learning practices are a key component of that. So I want to thank you all today for taking time out of your busy schedules to join with us, to share, and to learn together, to listen to and identify new ideas, and to forge new partnerships. And thank you for making learning a priority. We're fortunate to have a region where foundations and organizations collaborate for the greater good. We're grateful to the support of the Moses Taylor Foundation, who has made a significant and meaningful investment to the capacity of our regional nonprofit organizations through supporting training and technical assistance through the center, and whose support for the Learning Conference was right there from the beginning. We're grateful for their continued invaluable partnership and their thoughtful leadership, and for their willingness to collaborate and to be in the trenches with our team at the foundation logistically to make this conference happen. We're very thankful to the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation for serving as a presenting sponsor at the Learning Conference, and for making a contribution not only through funding the shared learning we're all going to embark on over the next 2 days, but also by presenting the afternoon keynote. We're appreciative of the Margaret Briggs Foundation for serving as a silver sponsor, and to Lamar Advertising for serving as our media sponsor. These key partners, in addition to the other foundations listed in our program, and the companies supporting our Learning Conference, were integral in making this conference happen. A special thanks to the Conference Planning Committee for their hard work and dedication of making this conference a reality. It's due to the hard work of a strong team led by our conference organizer, Maggie Martinelli at the foundation. So we have a very special program planned for you. Over the next 2 days, we have the opportunity to hear from a variety of presenters from both the national and regional stage, discuss how learning practices can be effectively implemented in organizations. We'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss, share, and network with colleagues. We will be, as Peter Senge said when he coined the term and meaning of a learning organization years ago, a group of people continually enhancing our capabilities to create results and where new patterns of thought are nurtured. So here to set the stage and to talk to us about surviving and thriving in a learning organization is Dr. Michelle McGowan, Associate Professor and Director of the Graduate Program in Healthcare Administration at King's College. Dr. McGowan is a licensed certified public accountant and has 20 years of experience in the hospitality and insurance industry. She is actively involved in a variety of nonprofit and foundation boards. She's a lifelong learner, supportive of the concept of organizational learning, and she's here to talk to us about outlearning the wolves. Welcome, Dr. McGowan.
Thank you, Laura. I'm here to do something a little bit different today. I will be reading you a story. And I am hoping that story will set the stage for the remainder of the conference as you move through these next 2 days. So without further ado, let's get started. This is a wolf. This is a sheep. Wolves eat sheep. Any questions? Okay. For this exercise, pretend, and we know that you're just pretending that you are the sheep. Who is the wolf? Name the other sheep in your flock. Can there be more than one wolf? Are there sheep for whom you are the wolf? If you have devoured one of your sheep today, can you imagine how it felt? Let us continue our story. Wolves have always eaten sheep. They will always eat sheep. If you are a sheep, you accept this as a fact of life. A flock of sheep once lived in a beautiful green pasture, but the flock's existence was not a peaceful one. The wolves posed a constant threat, casting a shadow of fear over the pasture. Sometimes the flock would settle into sleep at night and awake in the morning to find one of them was gone, likely being served up to a wolf with asparagus tips and mint jelly. There were several miles of barbed wire fence that surrounded the sheep's field. But the wolves, they came anyway. It was hard to live amid such uncertainty. Still, over the years, the flocks got bigger and bigger and bigger. The occasional loss, though very sad, was to be expected. This was the way it had always been. What protects you like the barbed wire from the wolf? How dependable is the barbed wire that you think is protecting you? Can you always count on the barbed wire? During what situations is the barbed wire insufficient protection? Another chapter. This is Otto. You should know that Otto will face an untimely demise by the end of the story, so don't get too attached to him. Otto was saddened by the rest of the flock's resignation to the wolves. "I have a dream," said Otto, perched on a hill where the rest of the flock could hear him. "I dream of a day when not another sheep will ever die to become breakfast for a wolf." "That's absurd," said Shep the sheep. "You can't stop the wolves. Remember the inspiring words of our ancestors. The wolves will come just as the sun will rise. And also, wolves, what jerks." "Indeed, I believe we're to be commended," said another sheep, "for we have prospered beneath the shadow of the wolf. Just look at how many of us there are." This made Otto even sadder. "As long as the wolf is present, our strong numbers tell us only a half-truth," said Otto. "We tell ourselves we are strong so we won't have to face up to the ways we are weak." Otto continued, "We all say the wolf cannot be stopped, but how do we know this is true?" A sheep named Curly answered, "It is true, when even the fence that surrounds us cannot keep the wolves away. At first, it stopped them, but they must have learned to jump over it. Wolves learn very quickly," Curly added. "Then we must learn even more quickly," said Otto. "We must make learning an ongoing part of the life in the flock. We will become a learning flock." "But we do learn," said Shep mildly indignant. "Why, just the other day, I learned to pull a thorn out of my hoof with my teeth." All the other sheep, especially those with thorns in their hooves, raised their woolly eyebrows in interest. "And I have learned to dig a hole. Watch this," said Gigi as she began vigorously clawing at the ground. I could push rocks around with my nose and make a pile," offered Jerome, who was just barely following the conversation. An excited murmur arose among the sheep at these new insights, which, though perhaps obvious to you and me, were quite innovative and useful in a sheep's world. "This learning is a good start," said Otto, a little encouraged. "Ideas like these must be shared for the benefit of the flock. But to thrive in the shadow of the wolf, it is not enough. We need a different kind of learning if we are to be a true learning flock." The flock looked down sheepishly. They were trying hard to understand. After some silence, Curly spoke. "Perhaps we could sleep in a circle." Otto motioned her to continue more. "Well," said Curly, I think we could protect ourselves better if we slept in a huddle and not scattered all over the place. That way, when the wolves come, it will be harder for them to get at us. But that doesn't really address the problem of the wolves, said Marietta, a little lamb. But no one heard her. The sheep are too excited by Curly's idea. Yes, yes, they all said. Tonight we will huddle against the wolves. Learning may be a good idea after all. Otto was frustrated by the sheep's attempt at learning, which, to him, seemed awful reactionary. But he felt relieved to see them at least united in purpose. This was a first good step. The least I can do, he thought, is to stay awake tonight and keep guard while they sleep. Warning, this brings us to the part of the story where Otto cashes in the chips, takes comfort in knowing he's gone to a better place where he would join Lassie, Old Yeller, and Bambi's mother. That night, Otto watched as the skies darkened and the sheep gathered into their huddle. By the time the crescent moon was high in the summer sky, the flock had fallen fast asleep. The next morning, Otto was gone. When the flock awoke the next morning and found Otto gone, they were devastated. Jerome didn't say anything. He just pushed a bunch of rocks into a pile with his nose. Perhaps not the most effective coping mechanism, but it seemed to work for him. Otto was a good sheep-side shepherd. He showed us a vision of a better day, eulogized Curly. He had fleece as white as snow, said someone from the back. But soon the mood turned sour. Those wolves, this is their fault, moaned Curly. What are we supposed to do, cried Shep. The wolves are smart, and they're strong, and they cannot be stopped. Our lives would be so much better if there were no wolves. If only that stupid fence were taller so the wolves could not jump over it. The flock sat there, dejected and miserable. Finally, Marietta, the little lamb, spoke again. How come the wolves only come sometimes and not all the time? She asked the flock. Everyone stopped. They looked confused. Marietta continued. If the wolves are smart and they can jump over the fence anytime they want, how come they don't come every night? If I were a wolf, that's what I would do. I would feast on sheep all the time. The others looked even more confused. All I'm saying, said Marietta, is that maybe the wolves aren't as unstoppable as we think. Something is stopping them, at least some of the time. What are you getting at, Marietta? Asked Shep. I'm saying the same thing Otto said. We must learn. We must do it together, and we must learn faster than the wolves. We tried being a learning flock already, said Shep, and look where that got Otto. That's because we've just started, said the wise little lamb. Look at what just happened. We tried something different, but the results we got were the same. What does that tell you? Everyone had to admit it was a pretty good question, but no one had an answer. It tells me it isn't enough just to change we do things. We must also broaden our vision and see the bigger picture. We need to learn how to learn differently. How? Everyone wanted to know. We could start by doing 3 things. 1, vision. Remember Otto's vision. Someday, not another sheep will ever die because of the wolves. From now on, everything we learn must lead us towards Otto's vision. 2, everyone says that wolves are too smart and cannot be stopped. We have made all our decisions thinking that this is true, and maybe it is, but what if it isn't? What if the truths we base our decisions on are not true? 3, let's figure out how to do things differently. What do we have to do to stop the wolves? What is it like to be a wolf? Let's go out and get some ideas and information. Let's find out as much about the wolves as we can. Kind of sounds like research-based evidence, right? Then let's start sharing everything we know with each other. Why don't we do some thinking on our own and then meet here this afternoon to talk? Yeah, this could be collaboration with our stakeholders. The meeting adjourned and the sheep all went their separate ways, lost in thought. Learning may be well and good, but that fence isn't tall enough to keep the wolves out. There's nothing we can do. We don't have the tools to even make it even taller. I won't stand for this kind of disrespect to our ancestors. They taught us that wolves are a fact of life. That little you is making a mockery of our heritage. But some of the sheep took what Marietta said to heart. Marietta's right. The wolves only seem to come at certain times. That doesn't make sense. Last summer, when we had the drought, wolves seem to come much more often. Maybe the wolves aren't jumping over the fence. It's pretty high, and I don't think any animal is that strong. Later that afternoon, all the sheep came back together to talk. A feeling of excitement buzzed among them. Impressed by the turnout, Jerome made an attempt to count sheep. But strangely, he found himself becoming sleepy, so we had to stop. Shep began the meeting. Friends, we are here today in memory of our friend Otto and his vision to eliminate 100% of deaths due to wolf-related attacks. Does anyone have anything to share? The sheep shared their thoughts. They engaged in dialogue on whether a wolf could really jump over the fence. They discussed strange timing of WRCs, wolf-related casualties, we all have to have our acronyms, right? And how they seemed to decrease after hard rains and increase during hot, dry periods. They even confessed how difficult it was for them to rethink their long-held beliefs about wolves. Just talking about these things energized the flock and gave them hope. Suddenly, Curly came trotting out of breath, very excited. "Follow me, hurry up," she said. Confused, the sheep ran after her, not at all sure where Curly was taking them. The final chapter. The flock hurried after Curly for about a mile. Soon they came to the fence, right at a spot where a small stream ran underneath. This was the same stream where the sheep often drank, although never this close to the fence for fear of the wolves. "Look," said Curly, pointing with her hoof to the spot where the fence crossed over the water. There, just above the surface of the water and caught on the barbed wire, was a clump of sheep's wool. "I was looking around for answers, and I found this, but I don't know what it means," she says. The sheep looked at each other in confusion. Finally, someone spoke up. "I got it! The wolves aren't going over the fence, they're going under it." Another sheep added excitedly, "That makes sense. When there's a drought, there's no water going under the fence. That's when the wolves crawl under. And after it rains, there's so much water, the wolves can't go under," exclaimed another. "So I guess that means wolves can't swim." Everyone laughed heartily at this. Perhaps the wolves weren't so smart after all. "There's only one problem," someone said. "We can't control when it rains. We're still at the mercy of the wolves, and now we're at the mercy of the weather, too." Oh, the flock felt quiet. Then Gigi spoke. "I think we're looking at the wrong problem again. It's true we can't control the weather, but we can control the flow of water. Watch this." And Gigi began to dig a hole, vigorously pawing at the ground under the fence with her hooves. Soon some of the other sheep joined in. "Don't just stand there, everyone. Help me," someone called. "Well, I could push rocks around my nose to make a pile," Jerome offered, and began building a small dam with rocks a few feet downstream. Shep stood by, pulling thorns out of the hooves of the other sheep as they dug. Soon a small pond began to form around the fence. Amazed by this achievement, the sheep let out a spontaneous collective bleating sound, an extremely irritating noise, but it sounds joyful if you're another sheep. In the days that followed, the flock had a beautiful pond upon which they could gather and drink and play. But best of all, the wolves stopped coming, the sheep stopped disappearing, and the fear was gone. "I'm glad we became a learning flock," said the sheep would later say as they nestled into sleep at night. "It felt good to know that we'll never have to go through anything like this ever again." But maybe they would. What is a learning culture? How does one go about institutionalizing this culture? And what is meant by learning? In the story, Shep the sheep was a little defensive when Otto introduced the idea of learning. "But we do learn," Shep protested. "Defensiveness is a natural reaction. To say we must become a learning culture might seem to imply that up until now, we have not been learning, but that's not necessarily true. Instead, the challenging facing organizations is to make learning institutional by defining and building organizational capabilities and structures for learning. These must include, but they're not limited to, our culture, our processes, our systems, and our skills. Sheep Skills 101, and they're very proud of these skills. Digging holes, moving rocks, and removing thorns from hooves. Those were valuable skills, but with no culture, process, or systems in place, these skills existed in a vacuum. The skills had never been brought together and leveraged for the greater good of the flock. And you can see how the sheep may have all learned individually, but it wasn't until learning was aligned, made deliberate, and institutionalized were they able to surpass even their own expectations. Now we must learn how to begin the journey towards a learning organization. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. McGowan. I'm pleased to introduce our morning keynote speaker, Rick Moyers, who comes to us with the depth of experience in the foundation world, as well as a career and board service at BoardSource, and served at the head of the Ohio Association of Nonprofit Organizations. I was asked to keep his extensive bio brief for my introduction by Rick himself, so I'm going to do that. But I will say that there's much more that he can and will tell you, particularly about what he's going to talk a little bit about today is practices of feedback in the social sector and how that contributes to learning. We're very fortunate that Rick Moyers is able to join us today. Thank you, Rick.
For those of you who can't see what I'm doing, there's duct tape involved up here. This is so my iPad doesn't slide off while in the middle of talking. Thank you, Laura, so much for that introduction. I am really happy to be here today and impressed by the turnout. And I want to start by saying that I'm not really a learning and evaluation guy. I'm just somebody who has seen a lot of stuff. So over the past 30 years, I've led a fundraising capacity building program for private high schools. I've worked at a national nonprofit dedicated to strengthening boards. I've led a state association of nonprofits, as Laura said, and I spent nearly 15 years in philanthropy at a place-based funder where we worked with about 175 organizations each year. I've also been on the boards of BoardSource, a regional association of grant makers, a community foundation, and a nonprofit center that serves the least populated county in Virginia. And since 2017, I've been an independent consultant working with a lot of different organizations and foundations. And if you're still with me, the point of telling you all that is not humble bragging, but to convince you that I've seen a few organizations and I have some standing to say that being a learning organization is not something that's easy. And before we get to that, I just want to ask you all a couple of questions to get a sense of who's in the room. So first of all, how many of you work at nonprofits? So almost all of you. How many of you are funders? And are there any board members here? That's awesome. And how many of you would like for your organizations to be a learning organization? And is there some constituency here that is opposed to that thinks it would be a bad idea? No, okay. So before I get much further, I thought a good place to start would be a reminder of what we mean by a learning organization. As has already been alluded to earlier, the author and organizational development guru Peter Senge first introduced the idea of the learning organization 30 years ago, in 1990, while I was still in my very first job out of college, with the publication of his best-selling book, The Fifth Discipline. According to Wikipedia, and I do all my best research on Wikipedia because it is 97% accurate, and I try to work at least one reference into it into every speech. According to Wikipedia, a learning organization is an organization that acquires knowledge and innovates fast enough to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing environment. And more specifically, learning organizations create a culture that encourages and supports continuous employee learning, critical thinking, and risk-taking, that allows mistakes and values employee contributions. And learning organizations learn from experience and experiment and disseminate knowledge throughout the organization to be applied to day-to-day activities. So now that you've seen that description of a learning organization, how many of you think that that describes the typical nonprofit organization? Wow. And what about your organization, your own organization? So there's a handful of you in the room. My point is that we've been talking about learning organizations for a long time, for 30 years, and everyone wants to be one. There's no one that is against it. But so many of us aren't there yet. So this morning I'm going to talk about why it's important for us to be learning organizations and why I think we sometimes struggle, both in nonprofits and in philanthropy. And I'm going to try to leave you with a few thoughts that I hope you'll be able to start putting into practice when you walk out of this room this morning. Peter Senge didn't write his books for nonprofits. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that he was writing mainly for business, with the idea that being a learning organization is an important advantage in a competitive industry. And while that may be true, I'd suggest that it's even more important for all of us in this room, because we're not in the business of selling toothpaste or making cell phones, because the work that we do is the work of changing lives and improving communities and making the world better, which I think is why many of us have chosen this work. So the stakes are really high, and the consequences of not learning are more significant than losing market share or failing to cash in on the next beverage craze. So I want to talk for a minute about why it is that we want to be learning organizations. So what are the stakes? And why is it so important for us to be learning organizations? Well, first of all, I think we want to be learning organizations to figure out what works and how we can do better. Most of us, in one way or another, are in the business of peddling solutions to the needs of people and communities. And if we're in that business, isn't it important that we make sure that we're offering the best solutions we can come up with and that we're making them better all the time? And related to that, I would be the first person to acknowledge that very few of us have the luxury of attacking our work with all the resources, both money and people, that we need or we would like to have. And so if resources are limited, isn't learning the key to making the best use of the resources that we do have? And finally, I think that learning is a way to leverage our biggest asset, which in our sector is people. And by people, I mean both the staff and the volunteers who work in our organizations and the people and communities that we serve. We need to be able to capture and learn from all of that creativity and knowledge and passion. And if we're not doing that, we're not being good stewards of our assets or our missions. Then why is this so hard, you might ask? So if it's a good idea and everybody wants to do it, and you all said you did, what are the barriers that keep us from being learning organizations? I'm going to talk about 7 based on my own experience, and I'm sure you all could help me come up with a few more. The first barrier is that learning is often, I think, seen as disconnected and maybe not essential to our real work. You might think of it as the tyranny of the urgent over the important, or the tension between nice to do and have to do. So this is the part where I'm going to pull back the curtain on philanthropy a little bit and offer you a guilty admission as an example. When I was vice president for programs at the Meyer Foundation in Washington, one of my jobs was to read and sign off on every final report of every grantee, which amounted to about 200 reports a year, from youth development programs and affordable housing advocates and health clinics and all kinds of organizations. And at certain points in the year, those reports would pile up on my desk. The pile sometimes was this high. And sometimes I would read the whole thing, and sometimes I'd just read the part that the program officer had flagged for me to read, and sometimes I would just sign the form if nothing was flagged, so that the grant could be closed. And the tragedy of all that, first off, I just want to pause and say, that doesn't mean that no one read the report. Someone read the report. It just wasn't me. So all of you final report writers out there, don't swarm me afterwards. The tragedy of all this is that I really liked reading final reports, and so did every single person on my team. And about once every 6 months, like clockwork, we'd have a conversation about how much we were learning from the reports and how we needed to have quarterly meetings to share what we were learning with each other. We all thought that was a great idea, and yet we never did it, not one time, because we were always too busy with the next round of grants or preparing for the next board meeting or responding to something that had happened in the community that seemed way more important than learning and reflection. And this was at a well-resourced institution where there weren't usually people sitting in our lobby waiting for our help. We should have done better. A second barrier to learning is that we don't fail. And if we do fail, we don't admit it. As somebody who's been on the receiving end of thousands of grant proposals and program evaluations and final reports over many years, I might reach the conclusion that failure is actually very rare in our sector. But I suspect that that's not actually the case. In nonprofits and philanthropy, I think that we like to be seen as experts and people who have the right answers and the right solutions, as people who are hardworking and committed and competent, and admitting failure goes against all that. And not only that, it would diminish our ability, if we're a nonprofit, to secure more resources in the future, which I think is one reason why, this will come as a shocker, I don't think that nonprofits and philanthropy are being completely honest with each other. What do you think? In 2004, my Fund for Shared Insight colleague, Melinda Tuan, wrote a classic Stanford Social Innovation Review article called The Dance of Deceit, about the struggle for power and resources between nonprofits and their funders, and also sometimes even between executives and their boards. Melinda described one part of the dance this way, and I'm quoting, "A foundation issues an RFP on the hot issue of the month, and nonprofits clamor to transform themselves into program experts on that issue in order to get funding for their struggling organizations. Each change in foundation giving guidelines results in contortions by the nonprofit providers to meet those guidelines." Does any of that ring true? Nonprofits trying to make themselves into the thing that is going to be eligible for funding. That's not an atmosphere that is conducive to candor and learning. And on the philanthropy side, I think that we often do an imperfect job, and when I say imperfect, I'm being kind, of explaining what information we need, why we need it, what we're hoping to learn, and what's influencing our decisions, which I think is related to a lack of agreement about what matters most, or who is driving the learning agenda. One of the most frustrating repeated conversations I had as a program officer was the conversation about outcomes. How many of you think you know what conversation I mean? Some of you. Well, here's how it would go. I would, I think, helpfully, point out to an organization that the outcomes that they were reporting weren't really outcomes but outputs. And sometimes they were just numbers. And the organization would then ask me what I thought they should be measuring. And I would say I didn't know, since I'm not the expert on their program and the people and communities they serve. Then they might ask a follow-up about what outcomes the foundation was most interested in tracking. And I would respond by asking them what outcomes they needed to track in order to learn. And that circular conversation would go on and on. And in all fairness, these organizations were just trying to figure out what they needed to do in order to keep getting funding. And in most cases, they didn't have the resources, and I mean the people, sometimes the software, sometimes the time, that they really needed to do measurement and learning. And I think that one of the reasons for that is kind of an underlying culture of scarcity and underinvestment in the infrastructure that we need to be learning organizations in our field and in our sector, which leads us to sometimes view curiosity and learning as luxuries that we can't always afford. As some of you may be aware, I've been involved in a series of research reports over nearly 20 years about various aspects of nonprofit leadership. Most notably, the Daring to Lead surveys of nonprofit executives in 2006 and 2011, but also surveys of next-in-line leaders and development directors, and even research on nonprofit operating reserves. And a couple of years ago, the Annenberg Foundation invited me and my longtime collaborator, Jean Bell, to reflect and present on what we had learned across all of that work over the years. And our big takeaway from all those studies was the underlying and pervasive culture of scarcity in the nonprofit sector. Executives and boards are preoccupied with fundraising, often with a mindset that there will never be enough funding and that spending on programs and direct services is the highest and best use of every dollar. And as a result, we tend to underinvest in key parts of our organizations, things like technology and professional development. Too many organizations are living on the brink of financial apocalypse, and too many organizations are competing to have artificially low overhead rates, and scarcity makes it hard to learn. And if those barriers weren't enough, we live in a culture, and I think we work in a field that values and incentivizes individual expertise. And I say this as someone who makes a living by having individual expertise and who was once accused by a colleague of being a knowledge hoarder, which was probably true. I think that for many of us, our areas of individual expertise are central to our identity. They're how we add value and have credibility in our organizations. So the idea of distributed expertise or shared organizational learning poses a threat to the order of things. And we haven't really set up a system of incentives that reward being a learning organization or group learning. And finally, and maybe this goes without saying, I don't think there's always a shared understanding among nonprofits, among philanthropy, among nonprofits and philanthropy and government agencies about basic measurement and learning concepts. We're not always clear on the difference between monitoring and evaluation, or on the difference between learning and reporting for purposes of accountability. And that's really important, because at the end of the day, measurement should support learning, and learning should inform decision-making. But that's not likely to be the case if you're doing all of your measuring for the purpose of reporting out to funders rather than informing your own decisions. So I want to close out this morning by focusing on a few things we can do if we're serious about becoming learning organizations. First, I think we can become much more thoughtful and deliberate about measuring what matters. I know it's kind of a cliche, but we can't afford to measure everything or to figure out what we're learning if we're focused on too many things. As organizations, we all need to figure out what matters, and not because it matters to someone else. like a funder, or because we can use the data to raise more money. Figure out what matters most to you and to the people that you serve. What you measure and what you learn should be based on what you think you need to know in order to do a better job and to understand your impact. And to my foundation colleagues in the room, and I know that you're here, I would encourage you to do some soul searching about what information you're requiring and collecting from grantees and what you're doing with that information and whether you're actually learning anything from it. Second, I think we all need to ask ourselves whether the cultures in our organizations, whether nonprofit or philanthropy, support and reward curiosity or encourage complacency. Do we even let people try things that might fail? And instead of glossing over our failures and dressing them up as successes, which I've done before, we need to embrace failure and do our best to understand what doesn't work. And we need to ask ourselves whether we have organizational cultures that would allow us to do that. And for funders, do you really support learning? And not just with lip service, but with money? And do you have the kind of relationships with grantees that would allow them to report their failures as well as their successes? I was one bullet behind. Finally, I think we should do more listening. I went into philanthropy in 2003 determined to do more listening than talking. For the most part, I'd like to think I stuck to that, although it does get harder as you go along. I certainly listen to grantees, and I listen to colleagues. What I failed to do is listen in any systematic or sympathetic or meaningful way to the people and communities we were trying to help with our grant making. Looking back, that's one of the places where I wish I could have a do-over. As we mentioned earlier, one of my clients is the Fund for Shared Insight, which is a national funding collaborative that is working to make listening and feedback a new normal in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, which is partly why I'm here today. And Fund for Shared Insight has partnered with Moses Taylor Foundation to support 4 nonprofits here in northeastern Pennsylvania to get feedback from the people they serve by participating in an initiative called Listen for Good. And I hope that many of you are going to join us for the breakout session later this morning to hear more from them. But what I wanted to say today to everyone in this room, whether you come to our session or not, is that learning doesn't just mean listening to the opinions of researchers or subject matter experts, and learning is about more than your own program evaluations or monitoring data. You can also learn in partnership and in community with the people that you serve. Their opinions are just as important as the opinions of evaluators and experts, and if you engage with them as partners, they can help you learn and improve. Getting feedback from the people that you serve is one of the most accessible and cost-effective ways an organization can start learning, and you'll get data that you can put to work right away. And if you do it in a high-quality way, if you are open to change when you listen, if you communicate back to the people who gave feedback and tell them what you heard and how you plan to respond, feedback can help transform the culture of your organization. So, as I wrap up, I want to emphasize that the challenges to being a learning organization that we've talked about already today are not unique to the nonprofit sector. Plenty of businesses and government agencies ought to be learning organizations and aren't. And the barriers that I described really aren't specific to measurement or learning. Resource constraints are real, and a culture of scarcity accounts for why nonprofits struggle with a lot of things, including fundraising itself, including evaluation, and even board performance. But I do believe that it's possible for any organization to make more conscious decisions about where time and resources are focused and what gets rewarded and what gets celebrated. I also believe it's possible for nonprofits, philanthropy, and other organizations that fund services to have more forthright conversations about what we need to learn. What do we need to learn together to get the best outcomes for the people and communities that we serve? And at the end of the day, I think that becoming a learning organization, like a lot of other things, is about culture change. And culture change can be hard and is sometimes just as much a journey as a destination. Which is why I chose Are We Learning Yet as the title for this presentation. And yes, I was thinking about kids sitting in the back seat of a family car on the way to a vacation destination. I vividly remember being one of those kids. And because my family lived deep in the mountains of Virginia, every destination took a long time to get to. I especially remember our family trips to King's Dominion, which is an amusement park near Richmond, which involved a 7-hour round-trip car trip. And all my sister and I could think about during that trip was that magical place that we were going to. And every minute that we spent in the car getting there was torture. And too often I think about that's how organizations approach ideas like becoming a learning organization. They think of it as a magical place that we'll get to in the future if we can just get better software or hire someone to be in charge of it or get through the annual gala or get a grant for it or something. The trip to get there feels tedious and we'd rather just be there. If I could go back and preach to my 12-year-old self sitting in the back seat of that car, I'd remind him that the trip is an important and necessary part of the journey. Try to enjoy it, and you'll never get to King's Dominion if you don't get into the car. And that same thing is true about becoming a learning organization or any other kind of cultural change work. We can't teleport or time travel our organizations to where we want them to be. Culture change is about the accumulation and repetition of small changes over time. It can be tedious, but we have to start somewhere. And are we there yet is an important question because we shouldn't lose sight of the destination. But an equally important question is, are we even in the car yet? And I guess that's what I would leave you with this morning. If we're serious about becoming learning organizations or any other kind of organizational change, we can't get stuck thinking about how far we are from where we want to be. If you want to be a learning organization, you can start today, but you gotta get into the car. Thank you all so much for listening to me. Yeah, we're
Yeah, so I'm gonna make the announcement.
okay.
Thank you so much, Rick. If you have any questions for Rick, in the app, the Whova app, there is a section community, and there is a community in there that you can ask Rick questions. It says, questions for Rick. So feel free to type those in. Feel free to type those questions in and we'll answer them from up here. Unfortunately, we don't have extra microphones, so please use the app if you have any questions for him. I want to give a sincere thank you to both Dr. McGowan and to Rick for providing the stage for us for the rest of the day, today's learning. We hope that this was an informative start to your day, and we very much look forward to the rest of the day. I will mention, you talked about funders and the important role that we play in encouraging learning. And this is one step of what we plan to do. But we are also working to innovate how we ask for grants. As those of you who have submitted LOIs recently to us, we have integrated into an online system. We're changing our questions to make sure they're relevant to what we need to know. And we're also going about changing our grant reporting and what we ask of you to make sure that it's information that is valuable to you, but also is information that we need for either reporting purposes or ensuring that our grant dollars are being used in the best way possible. So we're going to continue that commitment to all of you, and we encourage you to give us feedback of how we can always do better. So I have a question here from Brian Ebersol. Of course, he's the first one, right? Anybody who knows Brian. How can organizations on the learning journey do it together?
Well, that's a big question. That's like that's like a whole other speech. I think that one of the things I was thinking about as I worked on the presentation, which I didn't put in because I didn't think that there was enough time, is that I think that one of the reasons we create knowledge silos in our field is because we think of other organizations as competitors, and we think of the work that we are doing as learning organizations as kind of competitive intelligence that is going to help us do better. And so I think the first step would be for organizations, for groups of organizations to identify kind of what is their common learning agenda. And in my experience working with grantees, there are multiple organizations that are holding key pieces of information that if you put it all together might tell a completely different story. It kind of reminds me of the sheep. There might have been another flock that already understood that the wolves came when there was a drought. So, I mean, I think start by identifying partners and thinking about what you each bring to the table and what your common learning agenda would be. It's not, I'd be interested in the perspective of other funders. It's not something that I see a lot, and if a group of organizations had come to me as a funder proposing that, I would have found it really compelling.
So our next question is from Jessica Sorrenti. She asked, where would you start the learning journey for an organization? Does it start with the board, the director, CEO, or staff?
So if you look at my body of work over my entire career, I have a strong pro-CEO bias. I think that a lot of the most significant changes in organizations begin with CEOs. I think it's hard for a staff to take a CEO or a board on a journey that they don't want to go on. I think it's hard for a board to mandate that an organization become a learning organization because they're not in the day-to-day. And so the CEO is that linchpin or bridge person who I think in partnership with staff is best positioned to help an organization start its journey. But again, I think it's also hard for a CEO to dictate or mandate that an organization is going to become a learning organization if the staff isn't on board with that or cooperative with that. And I think that boards would be a hard place to start.
Maureen McGuigan says that as a funder, she's interested in new models of the application process that go beyond just the paper or online process to build better relationships and achieve more. For instance, sometimes funders are not often getting a true picture of a program or the grantees, and they're not sure what they want and feel that they can't be honest. So how do you feel that there's other ways that they can engage with their grantees?
This experience makes me feel like nonprofit Wikipedia. I don't have a lot of expertise in application processes. I think that my earlier observation about lack of honesty and transparency between nonprofits and funders was rooted in my sense that the traditional application process is almost an invitation for organizations to be not dishonest, but to cast themselves in a certain light based on the questions that the foundation is asking and the materials that are being requested. And my own experience was no matter how we tried to change it, it kept being that way. I have heard from There's a funder in the area of Virginia where I live now who doesn't take applications, who does face-to-face meetings and oral presentations with grantees, and I'm interested in seeing how that goes for them and what they learn from that. But that would be an example. But I don't have deep expertise on how we fix this problem. I think it's a problem.
Okay. And that is all the questions that I've received. So I want to give another congratulations and thank you to Rick for his time and for answering everybody's questions.
Thank you all.
So you know, I'm standing on my tippy toes because I'm afraid to move the mic. I thank you all for your attention and time this morning. We are going to be moving next into our breakout sessions. If you are already registered, you are good to go to the rooms. However, I will let you know we do have room ambassadors who will be checking you in with the same QR code they use to register you. So if you are already registered for that session, they'll be checking you in at the door. If you're not yet registered for the session, you might just have to wait to make sure there's enough seats for you in your desired session. I also would like to make a note that there are a number of exhibitors outside the hall this way. I encourage you to please visit them and thank them for their generous support of the conference, and they have some great information. If you are getting your formal headshot taken, those are all, it's all booked up today, but there is time tomorrow if you have not yet signed up. Those are over in Parlor E or F over there. Thank you all for your time this morning, and we look forward to seeing you back here for lunch.